The morning air in Napa Valley was cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of dew-kissed grapevines and the distant whisper of lavender from a nearby field. A thin mist blanketed the rolling hills as the first rays of sunlight began to stretch across the valley. Birds fluttered from tree to tree, their songs the only music breaking the calm. It was a picture-perfect start to the day, peaceful, ordinary, even serene. She stepped out of her house with her water bottle in one hand and her smartwatch already counting steps. Wearing a fitted blue jogging top, black leggings, and well-worn running shoes, she looked like anyone else getting in an early run before the world truly woke up. Her ponytail bounced gently as she jogged in place for a moment, stretching out her calves at the edge of her driveway. A neighbor waved as he loaded groceries into his car. She waved back, smiled, and turned toward the familiar trail that snaked through the wooded edge of the vineyard. The trailhead was quiet, no other joggers, no cyclists, just the rhythmic sound of her feet hitting the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves as a rabbit darted through the underbrush. She'd taken this route dozens of times before. It was her favorite. A narrow track through the trees opened to stunning views of the valley. There was a bench halfway through where she always paused to take in the view or sip some water. She knew every turn, every dip, every stretch where the sunlight broke through the canopy. That morning, she never made it past the first mile. Around 8:15 a.m., a hiker found her water bottle lying beside the bench. Her phone was nearby, screen cracked as if it had been dropped. One of her earbuds dangled from the side of the bench, tangled in the tall grass. But she was gone. No scream, no sign of a struggle. Just a lingering stillness. It was as if she had vanished into the air itself, leaving behind only a half-finished morning run in a valley that suddenly felt colder. Within hours of her disappearance, concern turned into alarm. Her fiancé, who had expected her back by 8:30 a.m., began to worry when she didn't answer her phone. By 9 o'clock, he drove the familiar jogging trail, calling her name, scanning the brush, checking parking lots. When he found her water bottle and phone beside the bench, the cracked screen still lit, panic surged through him. He called 911 with trembling hands. By midday, the quiet tranquility of Napa Valley was replaced by the roar of helicopters and the sharp bark of search dogs. Yellow police tape cordoned off the trail. Deputies, rangers, and dozens of volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields and forest, calling her name, searching ditches, checking culverts. Drones buzzed overhead. The local fire department brought in thermal imaging equipment, hoping she'd fallen, been injured, or was unconscious nearby. The community came out in force. Neighbors handed out water bottles and flashlights. People who'd never met her showed up to help. Local businesses printed missing flyers free of charge. Within 24 hours, her smiling face was plastered on every corner of town, on telephone poles, restaurant windows, gas stations, even vineyard gates. Social media lit up with appeals for information, photos of her last known outfit, and maps of the area she may have run through. Her parents flew in from out of state, their faces pale and stunned, holding press conferences with the sheriff's department. "Please," her mother begged, tears in her eyes, "if you know anything, if you saw anything, help us find our daughter." Despite the massive effort, not a single piece of clothing, no blood, no shoe print, and no camera footage provided a lead. The trail cameras along the vineyard roads showed nothing unusual. Her last GPS ping showed her stopping at the bench, then nothing. As darkness fell over the vineyards that first night, searchers refused to quit. Flashlights cut through the trees, voices continued to call her name. But the only response was the wind in the branches. It was as though the earth had swallowed her whole. As the initial shock began to settle, the investigation shifted from urgent rescue to painful analysis. The sheriff's department brought in additional detectives, and every aspect of her life was placed under a microscope. Who was she in contact with? What was her mental state? Was there any reason she might have run away on her own? Or was it something far darker? Suspicion, like fog, settled over the town. Her phone, though damaged, yielded some data. The last message she had sent was to her fiancé, just a heart emoji and, "On the trail now" heart. It was sent minutes before her usual warm-up. There were no unsent drafts, no strange calls or numbers. Her GPS showed the usual path, up to the bench where her belongings were found, then abruptly cut off. Detectives scoured her browsing history, social media, and even an old email account. Nothing pointed to depression, distress, or any indication that she intended to disappear. Then came the whispers. A local woman told police she had seen a black SUV parked oddly along a nearby dirt road the morning of the disappearance. The vehicle wasn't familiar to her, and the driver didn't appear to be from the area. Unfortunately, no license plate was visible, and by the time officers canvassed the area, the vehicle was long gone. Surveillance footage from nearby roads showed a few vehicles, but nothing matched the vague description. A retired runner claimed to have heard a scream in the woods around 8:20 a.m., but by the time he made it to the trail, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Could it have been a hawk? A startled deer? Or had he heard what no one else had? Detectives questioned friends, co-workers, her yoga instructor, her hairstylist. Everyone described her the same way: kind, driven, deeply in love with her fiancé. Nothing suggested a double life. But behind closed doors, theories multiplied. Was it a stalker? A random abduction? Someone from her past? Attention turned briefly to her fiancé. As the closest person to her, he was questioned extensively. Alibis were checked. Phone records reviewed. His anguish was genuine, his timeline clean. But as with many missing persons cases, the lack of answers made everyone a suspect. The days crawled forward with no new developments. The press began to withdraw. Volunteers had to return to work. Her posters started to fade in the sun. What began as a high-profile case slipped slowly into the cold shadows of the unsolved. And as weeks turned into months, the people of Napa were left with only fear, rumors, and a deepening mystery that felt like a wound that wouldn't close. The seasons changed, but the silence surrounding her disappearance never did. 2 years had passed since that morning jog, 2 years without a single new lead, sighting, or clue. Napa Valley moved on in its own quiet way, as towns do when grief lingers but answers refuse to come. The vineyards bloomed and withered in their cycle, tourists returned to sip wine and photograph golden hills, and life, for everyone else, resumed its rhythm. But for those who knew her, nothing ever truly returned to normal. Her parents became a fixture in the town, visiting from out of state every month, staying in the same modest inn near the trailhead. They rarely spoke during those visits, only walked the trail together in silence, pausing at the bench where her water bottle had been found. Locals began leaving flowers there, sometimes notes, even smooth stones with words like, hope, and peace, written in faded ink. Over time, that spot became a sort of unofficial memorial, a place where sadness settled like dust. The trail itself took on a different feel. Runners who used to frequent it changed routes. Parents grew hesitant to let their children hike alone. There was a heaviness to that stretch of trees and dirt, as if it had absorbed the pain of what happened and refused to let it go. People said the wind seemed louder there, the silence more intense. A few swore they heard footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one. The missing posters had long since disappeared from the storefronts, replaced by new advertisements, seasonal flyers, and event banners. But her face still appeared from time to time, on the occasional news update, or during the yearly candlelight vigil held in her memory. Her photo always showed her smiling, full of life, unaware of the story that would be written around her absence. Some residents admitted in hushed tones that they avoided the area altogether. A local barista confessed that she couldn't drive down the road near the trail without her chest tightening. "It's like something unfinished is trapped there," she said. "And it's waiting." Her fiancé moved away eventually. The house they had shared was sold quietly to a couple who never asked questions. He gave no interviews, left no farewell. It was too much. The future he'd built in his mind, the wedding, the children, the life together, had collapsed under the weight of not knowing. And so the town carried the memory of her in pieces, the joggers who glanced over their shoulders, the parents who held their children's hands a little tighter, the breeze that rustled through the trail with a whisper of something left unsaid. She had been here. She had been loved. She had vanished. And the town had not forgotten. The fog hung low over the hills that morning as the truffle hunter guided his pig along the forest edge bordering an overgrown section of vineyard land. He wasn't from Napa, just a traveling forager passing through, hoping to find wild truffles in California's moist post-rain soil. His pig, an aging but reliable sow named Clementine, was slow but sharp, her snout twitching with every subtle scent. They wandered deeper into a wooded area that few locals ever ventured into. Fallen branches crisscrossed the ground like forgotten bones, and thick ivy blanketed old tree trunks. Clementine snorted softly, her tail flicking as she caught a scent, one not of truffles, but something stronger, older, and unfamiliar. She froze, then began digging at the base of a gnarled oak tree near a shallow depression in the earth. The hunter watched as his pig grew more frantic. Dirt flew in every direction, and he knelt beside her to calm her, thinking she had found a particularly ripe patch. But as he pushed aside the soil she had unearthed, something unusual caught his eye: bright blue fabric, just a torn corner, faded and clinging to a clump of root. He brushed it aside gently, revealing more cloth, then what appeared to be the side of a rubber sole. He froze. The pig whimpered and backed away slightly. His hands, now trembling, dug more carefully. A chill ran down his spine as he uncovered the edge of what looked unmistakably like a human shoe. Panic and disbelief surged through him. He stumbled backward, fumbling for his phone, his fingers muddy and shaking. "I think I found something," he whispered to the 911 operator. Within the hour, the wooded area was swarming with officers, crime scene units, and environmental experts. They set up a wide perimeter, marking the disturbed earth, photographing every inch. The hunter stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly, his pig leashed and pacing nervously. What they found beneath the tree confirmed their worst fears. Shallowly buried, wrapped in layers of decayed clothing and tangled roots, were skeletal remains. Alongside them, almost miraculously preserved, was a rusted smartwatch, still clinging to a lifeless wrist, the band half disintegrated. A tiny, broken necklace lay nearby, its once polished pendant dulled by time and dirt. Forensic experts moved carefully, documenting everything. A coroner gently unearthed what was left of the blue athletic top, matching the description from the missing persons file. It didn't take long to suspect who the remains might belong to. DNA confirmation would take days, but in the hearts of the officers on scene, and the growing crowd behind the tape, it was already clear. 2 years of silence had ended with a pig's snout, a stubborn tree root, and a patch of forgotten earth. The case that had haunted Napa was no longer a question of if, it was now a matter of what happened. And who did this? The truffle hunter, still stunned, was offered a seat by an officer. He didn't speak much, only repeated softly, "She didn't deserve to be found like this." No one disagreed. The moment the skeletal remains were confirmed to be human, the woods were locked down with a precision and urgency that hadn't been seen in Napa since the day she disappeared. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered between trees, forming a perimeter around the shallow grave. The once forgotten stretch of forest, just a few yards from the old trail, was now crawling with forensic investigators, deputies, state police, and media trucks parked just outside the boundary. Detectives who had long since moved on to other cases were called back in. This wasn't just the break they'd been hoping for, it was the moment the entire community had been holding its breath for. Under the dense canopy of trees, evidence technicians moved slowly and silently. They didn't speak unless necessary. The gravity of what they were uncovering demanded complete focus. They began by carefully excavating the grave. The remains were remarkably intact for being buried so shallowly, though weather and time had left their mark. Alongside the remains, they recovered more fragments of the torn blue jogging shirt she was last seen wearing. Her shoes, separated slightly from the body, were still identifiable despite the moss that had grown over them. A cracked bone in the left forearm suggested a defensive injury. One of her earrings, small, silver, heart-shaped, was still tangled in her hair. Then came the key discovery, her smartwatch. It had deteriorated significantly, its screen shattered and frame corroded from months of soil and moisture, but miraculously, the data chip inside remained intact. Carefully preserved and handed off to digital forensics, it became an unexpected goldmine. Technicians would later recover partial GPS data, heart rate readings, and a final motion spike at 8:19 a.m., an abrupt, sharp elevation in heart rate, followed by a flatline. It was the digital record of a moment of terror, a confrontation, or possibly a struggle. Whatever had happened, her body had stopped moving just minutes after she reached the bench. Even more haunting, the time stamp on the watch placed her death within a narrow 10-minute window, just before the hiker reported seeing the bench that same morning. She had been that close to being found. But whoever did this had acted quickly and vanished just as fast. The search didn't stop at the grave. The surrounding area was combed in a grid pattern. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. In the underbrush 10 yards away, officers found faint tire impressions, nearly erased by time and weather. They matched the rough dimensions of a midsize SUV or crossover vehicle. Investigators bagged soil samples and small metal fragments, including a bent zipper pull and a piece of plastic trim that didn't match anything from the trail environment. Days later, DNA testing confirmed what the investigators already knew in their hearts: the remains were hers. The news was delivered privately to her family before the public announcement. Her mother collapsed in tears. Her father sat in silence for several minutes, hands clasped tightly, eyes red. They had prayed for closure. Now they had it, but it came at a price that made the air harder to breathe. News vans returned to the edge of town. Headlines flashed across screens: remains of missing jogger found after 2 years, foul play confirmed. The sheriff stood at a podium and delivered a simple statement: "We never gave up. And now, we will find out who did this." And with that, the cold case burned hot once more. With the discovery of her remains and the recovery of her smartwatch, the investigation reignited with a new level of urgency and clarity. The forensics team, now working around the clock, focused first on the watch. After days of careful handling, digital analysts managed to extract corrupted data from the device: motion readings, heart rate fluctuations, and a partial GPS trail leading up to her final moments. At exactly 8:19 a.m., her heart rate spiked sharply, accompanied by a sudden stop in forward motion. Analysts interpreted the data as signs of a struggle, possibly a fall, sudden fear, or a physical altercation. Her pulse remained elevated for 47 seconds before dropping to flatline. From that point, the watch recorded no further activity. Investigators now had a digital timestamp of her presumed time of death, and it aligned precisely with the time window police had always suspected. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the necklace found near her body. It was a delicate silver chain with a small pendant, gifted to her by her fiancé a year before she disappeared. When carefully cleaned and examined, analysts noticed a smudge, an oily fingerprint that had somehow been preserved in the grooves of the pendant. It was a long shot, but they entered the print into the state database. A match came back within a week. The print belonged to a man named Lucas Hartwell, a former Napa resident who had attended the same community running group as the victim. His name had appeared only once during the early investigation, in a sign-in log for a trail run 3 months before her disappearance. At the time, he hadn't raised any red flags: no prior criminal record, no visible connection to her beyond that single group meeting. But when detectives attempted to locate Hartwell, they discovered something suspicious. He had moved out of California shortly after the jogger vanished, within just weeks of the original investigation, and changed his name legally through a petition filed in Oregon. He'd been living under the name Evan Marsh, working as a maintenance supervisor at a remote hiking lodge near Bend. The timing was too precise, the sudden relocation too convenient. Armed with a warrant, authorities coordinated with Oregon State Police and tracked him to his cabin. When officers arrived, he didn't resist. He looked confused at first, then resigned. In his garage, they found a storage bin labeled camping gear, which contained a set of zip ties, gloves, and a faded black windbreaker. Buried beneath it was a GPS unit with saved trail coordinates, one of which led to the very bench where she had last been seen. Back in Napa, the sheriff's department held a press conference. For the first time in 2 years, they had a suspect in custody. The community's reaction was a mixture of heartbreak and rage. People gathered near the trailhead again, this time with candles, photos, and signs that read, "Justice for her," and "We didn't forget." Her parents were quietly present, standing behind the crowd, holding hands. It wasn't over yet, but they were finally closer to the truth. Behind bars, Lucas Hartwell, now exposed, remained mostly silent. His lawyer advised against cooperation. But investigators were building a case stronger than silence. The evidence was damning: the fingerprint, the GPS match, the unexplained move, and the timeline that fit like a puzzle finally coming together. And through it all, one thing echoed in the minds of everyone involved: her final steps had been tracked. Her voice, though silenced, had left behind a trail. And now, justice was finally catching up. The arrest of Lucas Hartwell marked a turning point, not just in the investigation, but in the emotional weight the entire community had carried for over 2 years. When news broke that he had been formally charged with first-degree murder, a strange kind of stillness settled over Napa Valley. It wasn't relief, exactly. It wasn't joy. It was something heavier, something like solemn vindication. The case was no longer a haunting question mark. It was now a story with a face, a name, a timeline, and, finally, the possibility of justice. Her family sat through every court hearing. Her mother never looked away from Hartwell, while her father kept a handkerchief clenched tightly in his lap. During the preliminary hearings, prosecutors laid out the evidence: the GPS logs saved in Hartwell's hiking device, the fingerprint on the necklace, the timeline of her smartwatch, and testimonies from people in the running group who recalled him asking strangely detailed questions about the victim in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Most chilling of all was the quiet calculation he'd shown in disappearing. Himself, changing his name, moving states, erasing his past, almost as if he'd expected to get away with it forever. He pled not guilty. But the mountain of evidence told a different story. Outside the courthouse, the public came together in ways no one had expected. Candlelight vigils turned into acts of community healing. A local artist painted a mural in her memory on the side of a cafe near the trailhead, depicting her smiling in the sunlight, surrounded by wildflowers and vines. People left handwritten notes, candles, running shoes, and photographs along the wall. "You are not forgotten," one message read. Another: "We carried your memory. Now the truth carries you home." Her parents, while exhausted, finally felt the fog begin to lift. They worked with the county to build a memorial bench near the tree line close to where she had been found. The bench bore a simple inscription: "Run free. Loved, missed, remembered." Visitors came quietly, some sitting in reflection, others leaving behind small tokens, bracelets, flowers, even race medals from runners who had never met her but had felt her story deeply. As the trial date approached, the story gained national attention. Media outlets revisited the timeline, podcasts dissected the investigation, and people everywhere wondered how someone could walk among them, so ordinary on the surface, while hiding something so horrifying underneath. But for her family, it wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about legacy. They established a foundation in her name to fund safety measures on public trails, more lighting, emergency beacons, and awareness programs about trail safety. Her memory became more than a tragic headline, it became a movement. And in that quiet vineyard town, life slowly began to stitch itself back together. The sun still rose over the hills. Joggers returned to the trail, some in groups now, some wearing bracelets in her favorite color. The air still smelled of earth and vines and promise. But the land remembered. The people remembered. And most of all, they made sure her story did not end in that forest. It lived on in action. In justice. In love that refused to let go.